The road into the inn 1887 was a long, twisting stretch of dirt that cut through heavy woods and steep hillsides. Most travelers moved through it with a kind of quiet patience, knowing that the land could turn harsh without warning. The trees stood tall and packed close together, blocking out much of the daylight and leaving the paths dim even at noon. When the wind rushed through the branches, it carried a low whistle that sometimes sounded like a voice calling from far away. People said they had always been a place where stories lived longer than the truth, and where anything could be waiting behind the next bend. That was the world the family lived in, a world where a warm meal and a glowing window along the roadside felt like a blessing for strangers who wandered through. Just a few miles off the main trail stood a small wooden inn that looked older than the land around it. It leaned slightly to one side, though it never fell, and smoke always drifted from its chimney. Visitors said the smell of soup greeted you before the door did. Some called it charming in a rough sort of way, with mismatched chairs on the porch and a sign that hung crooked over the entrance because no one bothered to fix it. It was the kind of place that seemed safe, even comforting, especially when night began to fall faster than you expected. And travelers came often, hunters, farmers, salesmen with dust on their boots. They would see the light in the window and think they had found a good place to rest for a night or two. Most of them never stayed long enough to look deeper. Most never thought anything was wrong. The family who owned the inn had been there for years, and people around the area heard their name often. They were known for keeping to themselves, but in a polite way. When one of them rode into town for supplies, they smiled and chatted enough to seem friendly, but never so much that you felt close to them. They were the kind of people you didn't question. They worked hard, paid in cash, spoke little, and carried themselves in a way that made others keep a respectful distance. No one could point to a reason why, they just did. Something about them felt off, even though you couldn't explain what it was. Inside the inn, the walls held the same quiet as the family. There were long tables built from rough boards, candles set in old bottles, and a kitchen that always felt too warm because of the fire that never went out. The family cooked large pots of soup almost every day, filled with whatever vegetables and meats they could gather or trade for. Travelers praised their food more than anything else. It tasted rich, seasoned in a way that made people close their eyes for a moment after the first spoonful. Many swore it was the best meal they had ever had on the road, and the family accepted the praise with small smiles that never reached their eyes. Before anything terrible happened, life around the inn looked steady on the surface. The family woke before dawn, moved through their chores without complaint, and spoke to each other in low voices that others could rarely hear. They worked like a unit, smooth, practiced, almost rehearsed. Each person knew their role. One took care of the kitchen, another tended to the livestock behind the inn, and another watched the road from the windows. Their movements were neat, controlled. To a stranger, that might have seemed like simple discipline, the way people lived. But locals sometimes wondered why their harmony felt so forced, like they were covering something beneath it. A few travelers who passed through remembered little moments that didn't feel right. One man recalled that when he asked for water, two family members exchanged a look so fast he almost thought he imagined it. Another remembered that one of them insisted on carrying his bags to his room, even though he said he could do it himself. A woman said she woke up in the night and heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and steady, as if someone was checking each door. None of these moments seemed dangerous by themselves. Just odd, just enough to make the hair on the back of your neck rise without knowing why. There were small signs even before anyone knew what they meant. The way the inn was always full of people, one day, then suddenly empty the next. The way some travelers were never seen leaving, though the family insisted they had gone at dawn. The way the woods behind the inn grew dense and quiet, with soil that looked like it had been turned over more times than a garden ever needed. No one asked questions because no one wanted trouble. In places like you learned not to dig into business that wasn't yours. But rumors waited in the air, like smoke that never fully cleared. The family itself lived with their own tensions, though they never showed it directly. But it came out in the way they spoke to each other, too soft, too careful. Their eyes followed one another's movements with a kind of sharp awareness, almost like they were guarding something. Power in that house didn't rest evenly. Someone held more sway than the others, and the rest lived under that shadow. You could see it in the way they hesitated before answering certain questions, or how their shoulders stiffened when a stranger asked about their past. Something inside that family moved like a quiet storm, waiting for a reason to break. Travelers came and went. The inn stood strong through rain, cold nights, and long summers. And behind all of that, the friendly soup, the warm fire, the polite smiles, something darker lived in the shadows of that home. It didn't show itself all at once. Instead, it spread slowly, like a crack beneath the floorboards that no one noticed until the day the whole house gave way. No one knew then that the peaceful life people saw from the outside was only the cover for a truth that would soon unravel piece by piece until the land itself felt changed. The story of the family had already begun, and the hints of what they were capable of were already there. Most people just didn't see them in time. The first signs of trouble at the inn began quietly, the same way most danger starts, small moments that seemed harmless until they gathered enough weight to crush everything beneath them. Back then, travelers could still walk through the front door and smell fresh soup boiling in the kitchen. They would hear the low hum of voices from the family working behind the scenes. Nothing looked wrong. But inside those walls, something had already started to shift as a rope pulled too tight, waiting to snap. It began with small arguments that the family tried to hide, short, sharp whispers behind closed doors, footsteps packing late into the night, the sound of something heavy hitting a table, and then silence. Guests didn't hear most of it, but locals who stopped by for a drink or a meal noticed the way the air inside felt stiff. The oldest member of the family, the one who seemed to control everything, had grown more watchful, more suspicious. His eyes followed every movement, as if waiting for someone to make the wrong step. The others seemed to shrink under his gaze. Even a simple mistake, like burning bread or spilling water, led to a tension so thick it almost choked the room. The rising pressure didn't come only from inside. Life in the late 1800s wasn't easy, especially in the money had grown that year. The harvest was poor, and the few livestock they had weren't enough to keep the inn running without the steady stream of travelers. Every coin mattered, every sale mattered, and every stranger who stepped through the door became more valuable to them. That alone would have stressed any family, but they carried something heavier, debts from years ago that still hung like chains around their necks. They owed money to people who didn't forget, and those people had started visiting again. Rumors said a man came by one afternoon, dressed in black and riding a large horse. He didn't stay long, just spoke in a low voice on the porch, but the look on the family's faces afterwards made it clear the visit didn't bring good news. No one knew exactly what they owed or why, but the fear was obvious. The oldest slammed the door after the man left and didn't come out for hours. That night, the family ate in silence, each one lost in their own thoughts. The fire burned low, throwing shadows on the walls that twisted like figures trying to escape. As the pressure built, the family's relationships began to crack. The younger members grew restless, angry even. They wanted something different, freedom, control, a sense of worth beyond the inn's walls, but the older one in charge kept them close, controlling everything from the finances to the rules they followed. His grip tightened as he sensed a change in the air. He feared losing his position more than anything. Some nights, he even checked the rooms one by one, making sure no one had slipped out. The others saw this and felt trapped, as birds locked in a cage too small for their wings. This was where jealousy began to creep in. One of the younger members had started talking more often to travelers, especially those who looked wealthy or friendly. He liked hearing stories of the world outside, the cities, the railroads, the way the country was changing so fast. He admired the freedom those travelers had, the choices they could make without asking permission, and he began to envy them. That envy soon turned into something sharper. When one traveler offered him a chance to leave the inn and work on a farm up north, he listened with an eagerness that didn't go unnoticed. The oldest saw the spark in his eyes and felt threatened. Control was slipping. So he pulled the young man aside after the traveler went to bed and told him clearly that leaving wasn't an option. The argument grew loud enough for the others to hear through the thin walls. It ended with the young man storming outside into the cold night, while the older one followed him with slow, deliberate steps. By morning, the traveler who had made the offer was gone. He left before sunrise, the family said. But some locals noticed the way the young man avoided eye contact that whole day, his hands shaking as he chopped wood behind the inn. Something had happened between him and the older that night, something that made him quieter, more obedient, but also more broken. Another crack formed when a young woman started visiting the inn more often. She lived nearby, helping her family with their farm, but she came by whenever she had free time. She was kind, soft-spoken, and carried herself with a calm confidence that drew attention. One of the boys liked her, and she seemed to like him too. Their conversations were innocent at first, full of shy smiles and short laughter, but the older didn't approve. He didn't want any of them forming attachments outside the family, not when things were so unstable. He feared that love or affection from the outside would give someone the courage to leave. His disapproval turned into control. He warned the boy to stay away from her, claiming she would distract him from his duties, make him weak, or worse, learn too much about their business. But the more he forbade it, the more the boy wanted to see her. Their secret meetings became the first step toward rebellion. The older sensed it and grew harsher, pushing the boy until resentment began to boil inside him. Meanwhile, money problems grew. Fewer travelers passed through that month because of flooding on the roads. Supplies ran low. The inn felt colder, and the family began arguing more openly now. It wasn't just whispers, it was raised voices, slammed doors, angry footsteps on creaking floorboards. The younger ones started questioning why they had to live this way, trapped under one person's rule. Why did they have to shoulder the weight of secrets they didn't fully understand? Why did they have to pretend everything was normal, while fear circled them like a hungry animal? Then came the incident that changed everything. One night, a group of travelers arrived later than usual, 2 men and a woman. They were muddy, exhausted, and clearly carrying something valuable based on the way they kept checking their bags. The older saw this instantly. He watched the way they whispered to each other, the way they guarded their belongings, and something dark flickered behind his eyes. The younger members noticed it too, that familiar look that meant he was thinking of doing something he shouldn't. Dinner that night felt unnervingly tense. The travelers tried to make conversation, but the family responded with half smiles and clipped answers. The woman kept glancing toward the door as if she wanted to leave. The older kept watching her and the bags they carried. Later, one of the younger members overheard him whispering to another adult in the family, talking about the money those people likely had and how it could solve everything. The younger one who overheard it felt sick. He knew what those words meant. He had seen things before, small things that didn't make sense, people who left without paying or without saying goodbye, rooms that were cleaned too fast, and soil behind the inn that was always freshly turned. He remembered the traveler who had offered him a new life. He remembered the fear in his own chest when he realized that the man didn't actually leave. That night he considered going to the sheriff. He even stepped outside, walking toward the road. But he stopped when he thought of the consequences. If he left, the family would come after him. If he talked, something terrible might happen to him, or worse, to the girl he liked. So he went back inside and tried to pretend none of it was happening. But the older sensed his fear. He called him into the kitchen after everyone else was asleep and asked him a simple question. "Do you understand what you owe this family?" The young man hesitated, and that hesitation alone was dangerous. The older grabbed his arm hard enough to leave bruises and whispered that leaving wasn't an option. Not for him, not for any of them. He said it in a voice so cold that it felt like the room had lost all warmth. After that night, the family began to crumble. The young man drifted into a state of quiet panic. He barely slept, jumped at sudden sounds, and avoided looking at the travelers staying above them. He knew something terrible was coming. He felt it with every breath, and he wasn't the only one. The woman in the inn sensed it too. She kept whispering to her companions that something felt wrong. She asked if they should leave, but they were too tired, too trusting, too unaware of the danger staring at them through the cracks. In the days that followed, the older pushed everyone harder. He said they needed to act soon. He said they were running out of time and choices. Some family members tried to argue, but he shut them down with threats or silent stares that cut like blades. His desperation turned into something cruel. He wanted control more than anything, even if it meant forcing his own kin to follow him into darkness. The young man who had once dreamed of leaving now found himself trapped between two fears, the fear of the older and the fear of what was about to happen to the travelers. Each night, he woke drenched in sweat, hearing footsteps in the hallway and knowing they weren't just checking doors anymore. They were planning, preparing. Meanwhile, the woman from the nearby farm noticed the boy had changed. When she visited the inn one afternoon, he barely spoke to her. His eyes were hollow, his voice flat. She reached for his hand, but he pulled back, whispering that she shouldn't come anymore. She didn't understand at first. She thought maybe he had lost interest. But then she saw the fear in his face, the fear he was trying so hard to hide. She knew something terrible was weighing on him, something he couldn't say out loud. She left the inn that day with her heart pounding, knowing that whatever was happening inside that house was bigger than she could imagine. As the days stretched on, the tension reached a breaking point. Every person in the house felt it pressing against their ribs. Conversations grew sharp, frantic. The youngest members whispered to each other about leaving, while the older ones tried to keep them in line. The man who controlled the house became more unstable, packing at all hours, muttering to himself about debts and loyalty. His grasp on reality loosened. The bags of the travelers became a symbol of salvation to him, One final chance to fix everything, to keep the family together under his rule. And one cold night, the storm inside the family finally burst open, pushing them toward the crime that would haunt them for generations. The air felt heavy, the fire dimmed, and something unseen seemed to hold its breath as the family stood on the edge of a choice they could never come back from. The night the crime finally unfolded began like any other, with the wind pushing against the wooden walls of the inn and the smell of smoke drifting from the kitchen. But inside the house, everything felt different. The halls were too quiet, the rooms too still, and the people inside moved like they were trying not to wake something sleeping beneath the floor. Even the travelers noticed the strange mood in the air. They whispered to each other at dinner, saying the place felt colder than when they arrived. They tried to laugh it off, but the unease clung to them like a second skin. The older watched them from across the table, his eyes sharp and hungry. He didn't bother hiding the way he stared at their bags, their coats, their boots, anything that might hold money or valuables. His desperation had reached a point where he could no longer hide the darkness inside him. The others in the family sensed it too. They knew he had made up his mind. Tonight was the night he meant to act. And unless something stopped him, they would all be pulled into whatever terrible thing he was planning. The young man who had tried so hard to escape could barely eat. His hands shook as he held his spoon, and he kept glancing at the travelers like he was hoping they would suddenly get up and walk out the door. But they didn't. They were tired. They trusted the warmth of the inn more than their instincts. They didn't see the looks the family exchanged, the silent signals that passed between them like small sparks before a fire. When dinner ended, the older stood up slowly, his chair scraping across the floor. He told the travelers that the upstairs rooms were ready and that they should sleep well because a storm was coming. The way he said it made the hair on the back of the young man's neck rise. It wasn't a warning about the weather. It was something else, something darker. The travelers went upstairs, unaware of the danger waiting just behind them. The woman paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking around one last time. Her eyes landed on the young man, and he looked back with an expression that almost begged her to leave. She frowned, sensing the fear in his face, but she didn't know what it meant. She followed the others, her footsteps slow and uncertain. As soon as they reached the top, the older turned to his family. His voice was low, rough, and commanding. "Tonight," he said, "we do what must be done." The room went still. No one spoke. No one dared to. The younger one stared at him in shock, but he didn't care. His mind was fixed on one thing, survival. To him, this was not murder. It was fixing a problem. It was taking what they needed to keep the inn running and the family intact. At least, that's how he convinced himself. He wrapped his fear and greed in a story that made him feel justified. He gave each person a task. One was to watch the stairs, one was to block the back door. And the young man, the one who wanted to run, was told to bring the tools. His stomach twisted when he heard the word tools. He knew exactly what the older meant. He didn't move at first. He stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, praying for something to stop this from happening. Maybe the storm would knock out the lanterns. Maybe the travelers would come back down, saying they forgot something in the dining room. Maybe the girl he liked would show up at the door, giving him a reason to say no. But none of that happened. The only sound was the wind brushing against the windows and the quiet breathing of the people who were about to do something they could never undo. Now the older growled, and the young man obeyed. He brought the tools, a rope, a heavy iron bar, and a knife that looked too sharp for any honest chore. His hands trembled as he set them on the table. The older nodded without a word, picking up the knife and testing its edge. His face didn't show emotion anymore. His eyes were empty, as if he had already stepped past the point where guilt could reach him. The family moved as a group toward the stairs. Their footsteps were silent, their breaths shallow. The young man walked last, feeling his heart hammer against his ribs. Every step felt like it was dragging him deeper into a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Upstairs, the travelers had just settled into their rooms. They were talking quietly, laughing a little, trying to shake off the strange feeling from dinner. The woman sat near the window, brushing her hair, unaware of the shadow moving outside her door. The men unpacked their bags, placing a few coins on the dresser, knowing they would pay in the morning. They didn't hear the soft creak of the floorboards or the faint click of the latch. The older entered first, his steps steady and cold. The two men looked up in confusion, their faces shifting from surprise to fear in a single moment. The woman froze, her brush slipping from her hand. "What are you doing?" one of the men asked, voice tight with unease. The older didn't answer. He raised the iron bar and swung. The sound was sickening, a sharp crack followed by a thud as the man collapsed onto the floor. Panic exploded in the room. The woman screamed. The other man lunged forward, grabbing the older by the arms. Furniture toppled. Glass shattered. The room filled with the sounds of struggle, grunts, gasps, desperate cries. The walls seemed to shrink, trapping them all inside the violence. The young man stood in the doorway, frozen in terror. His eyes went wide as he watched one of the men fall back, bleeding from the head. The woman tried to run toward him, reaching out for help, her eyes begging him to do something. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He felt his body lock in place, caught between fear of the older and horror at what was happening in front of him. One of the other family members forced the woman down, covering her mouth to muffle her screams. She kicked and clawed, her nails leaving deep marks on the wooden floor. Tears streamed down her face. She shook her head wildly, as if refusing to accept what was happening. The older turned toward the young man. "Finish it," he ordered. Those words hit him like a punch to the chest. Finish it, as if this were a chore, as if these were not real people fighting for their lives. He stared at the knife in the older man's hand and felt his stomach drop. The room spun. He wanted to run, he wanted to shout. He wanted to grab the travelers and pull them out of the inn, but his legs wouldn't move. "No," he whispered. The older's eyes narrowed. "Do it." "No," his voice cracked, louder this time. The older stepped closer, raising the knife toward him. "If you don't," he said coldly, "you'll end up beside them." That broke something inside the young man. A scream tore out of him, not a scream of courage, but one of pure fear. He lunged forward, grabbing the woman by the arm, trying to pull her away from the others. Chaos erupted again. The older grabbed him, shoving him back hard enough to send him crashing into the wall. The woman fell, hitting her head on the edge of the bed. Her cry turned into a weak moan. In that moment, everything became a blur. Shouts, movement, blood on the floorboards, the sound of someone gasping for air. The iron bar hit the ground. The knife flashed in the dim lantern light. A man crawled toward the door, leaving a smear of red behind him. A final blow echoed through the room, followed by silence thick enough to crush the breath from the air. When it was over, the room looked like a storm had ripped through it. Blood stained the wooden boards. Furniture lay broken. The travelers lay still, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, their faces frozen in fear. The young man stood over them, shaking so hard he could barely breathe. Tears blurred his vision. His chest heaved as he tried to process what had just happened. He felt sick. He felt hollow. He felt like a piece of himself had been ripped away forever. The older wiped the knife on a cloth, his breath steady, his expression flat. "We had no choice," he muttered. "They forced our hand." But the young man knew that was a lie. They had choices. They had hundreds of chances to stop this, but they didn't, and now 3 innocent people lie dead because of it. The immediate aftermath was a mix of panic and cold calculation. Some family members cried. Others stood stiff, refusing to look at the bodies. The older barked orders, telling them to clean the room, gather the belongings, and drag the bodies downstairs before the sun rose. He acted as if this were just another problem to fix, as if it wasn't a nightmare that would stain all of them forever. The young man tried to help, but his hands kept slipping. His breath came in sharp bursts, and he kept whispering, "This isn't right, this isn't right," until one of the others grabbed him by the shoulders and told him to pull himself together before the older noticed. They worked through the night, their movements jerky and frantic. Every sound made them jump, the groan of the old staircase, the howl of the wind, the creak of the front door shifting in the breeze. They were terrified someone would come knocking, terrified someone had heard the screams, terrified the bodies would somehow rise and accuse them. When dawn finally came, the inn looked clean again. The room upstairs had been scrubbed. The belongings of the travelers had been packed away. The bodies had been carried out back where the earth waited, cold and dark. But no amount of washing could remove the memory of what had happened. The young man felt the weight of it settle deep in his bones. He knew the family would try to move on, pretend nothing had happened, and keep the inn running. But he also knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Every step, every breath, every moment from now on would be haunted by the sound of that broken cry, that final blow, that terrible silence. The crime had happened, and they would never forget it. The aftermath of the crime sends shockwaves through everyone connected to it, leaving a fractured emotional landscape that no one is prepared to navigate. In the immediate hours after the truth comes to light, disbelief becomes the dominant reaction. Those who once trusted, respected, or loved the perpetrator struggle to process the revelation, clinging to denial as a temporary shield from reality. Some insist that there must be a misunderstanding, that the evidence is incomplete, biased, or manipulated. Others attempt to justify the actions, offering explanations based on stress, emotional breakdowns, or provocation, as if softening the narrative could somehow undo the horror of what actually happened. The silence in homes, workplaces, and community spaces is heavy, filled with unspoken questions, confusion, and the collapse of long-held illusions. Everyone tries to regain control of the narrative in their own way, either by distancing themselves from the perpetrator or by constructing careful justifications meant to protect their own reputations. As the truth spreads, those closest to the perpetrator are thrust into a relentless emotional storm. The perpetrator themselves undergoes a psychological unraveling, initial adrenaline giving way to crushing fear and remorse. Sleepless nights follow, filled with intrusive memories of the act and annoying paranoia about consequences. Their previous life, routine, relationships, personal ambitions, suddenly feels like a distant memory, severed from the person they've become. Loved ones experience their own devastation. Family members wrestle with humiliation, betrayal, and grief, questioning every past interaction in search of warning signs they might have missed. Some become fiercely defensive, refusing to accept that the person they cared for could commit such an act. Others retreat emotionally, unable to reconcile their love with the horror now attached to that identity. Friendships dissolve under the weight of uncertainty, mistrust, and embarrassment. Romantic relationships collapse as partners confront feelings of being manipulated or lied to, realizing that the person they thought they knew was hiding a darker truth. For the victims and their families, the emotional injuries run far deeper. The aftermath is an unbearable mixture of sorrow, anger, and shock that refuses to fade. They are forced into the public eye, where the constant retelling of the crime, in courtrooms, interviews, and news articles, forces them to relive their trauma repeatedly. Everyday routines fall apart. Sleep becomes elusive, and normal tasks feel heavy and meaningless. Communities around them mourn quietly, grappling with the sudden loss of safety. What was once a familiar and trusting neighborhood now feels haunted by fear and suspicion. People begin to question their past interactions, wondering how such a tragedy managed to grow unnoticed in their midst. Children develop new fears, adults become hyper-aware of their surroundings, and families struggle to rebuild trust even with those they once considered pillars of support. The wider community response grows increasingly complicated as media attention intensifies. News outlets publish exaggerated versions of the story, sensationalizing details to attract attention. Social media becomes a battlefield of speculation, misinformation, and harsh judgments. Public opinion begins to split sharply, some demanding severe punishment, others insisting the story is more complex than it appears. The perpetrator's previous reputation becomes a focal point. If they were once admired, trusted, or held a position of influence, the betrayal feels even more profound. People reevaluate past interactions, reinterpreting memories through the lens of the crime. Former achievements, good deeds, or positive public images are overshadowed entirely, now viewed as ironic or manipulative. Community divisions deepen as heated debates unfold, both online and in local spaces. Those who sympathize with the perpetrator's background or emotional state clash with those who see no excuse for what happened. As legal proceedings begin, the consequences extend far beyond the courtroom. Investigators intensify their efforts, pulling in witnesses, examining digital footprints, and reconstructing the series of events leading up to the crime. People connected to the case face stressful interrogations that expose hidden guilt, suppressed knowledge, or previous lies. Secondary participants, those who helped hide evidence, lied to authorities, or unknowingly contributed, face their own punishments. Jobs are lost, reputations crumble, and careers derail. Even those who did nothing legally wrong feel the weight of social judgment, experiencing cold stares, whispered conversations, and the quiet severing of personal connections. Social exile becomes its own form of punishment. The community begins to treat anyone associated with the crime as tainted. Meanwhile, attempts at emotional recovery begin, slow, fragile, and uneven. Families of victims hold vigils or private gatherings, seeking some form of collective comfort. Community leaders speak about healing and unity, though everyone knows the wounds are far from closed. The crime becomes a reference point that divides life into before and after, altering the emotional climate of the entire area. People struggle with guilt, those who witnessed suspicious behavior but stayed silent, those who offered support to the perpetrator, and those who unknowingly contributed to circumstances leading up to the event. Therapy sessions, spiritual guidance, and isolation become coping mechanisms. Some characters break down completely, unable to bear the psychological weight, while others begin rebuilding themselves slowly, painfully, determined not to let the trauma define the rest of their lives. Even as time passes, the shadows of the event linger. The community gradually regains a sense of normalcy, but it is a changed normal, more cautious, more fragile, more aware of hidden darkness. Conversations are quieter, people are more reserved, and once strong bonds feel less certain. The psychological scars, both visible and invisible, remain etched into the lives of everyone touched by the crime. Though progress is made, healing remains incomplete, setting the stage for a conclusion that will reflect on justice, transformation, and the long-term consequences of a single, devastating act. The final outcome of the case does not bring the sense of peace that many had hoped for. Instead, it leaves behind a quiet heaviness that everyone feels in different ways. The legal process moves slowly, dragging through months of hearings, testimonies, and arguments that expose every dark detail of the crime. When the verdict finally arrives, it feels less like a moment of victory and more like a reminder of everything that was lost. The perpetrator receives a long sentence, one that reflects the seriousness of the crime, but even that does not settle the emotional questions that linger in the minds of those affected. Justice has been served in the technical sense, but the people closest to the case know that nothing can truly undo the damage. The families involved carry the weight of what happened into their futures, each of them changed in ways they never expected. Some find comfort in the idea that accountability was finally reached. Others feel no comfort at all, only a deep sadness that becomes part of their daily lives. The perpetrator enters prison as a different version of the person they once were. Their confidence, arrogance, or sense of control fades as the reality of confinement becomes clear. Days are long, nights feel endless, and every moment is a chance for self-reflection that they once avoided. They replay the events over and over, trying to understand how things spiraled so far. At times, they feel anger, at times guilt, and at times a strange emptiness that grows larger the more they think. The world they once navigated with confidence is gone. Loved ones visit less often. Friends disappear. Even those who defended them in the early stages quietly step away. Their life narrows into a small space where the consequences cannot be ignored, and the person they become in that environment is someone marked by regret, fear, and a painful kind of self-awareness. Prison becomes both punishment and mirror, forcing them to finally confront everything they tried to avoid. The lives of the victims' families shift in quiet, difficult ways. They learn how to live with absence, not only the absence of the person they lost, but also the absence of safety, trust, and the belief that life is generally fair. Some find ways to honor their loved ones through charitable work or community events. Others withdraw, unsure how to talk about what they've experienced. Relationships inside these families change, too. Some become closer, leaning on each other in ways they never did before. Others drift apart, unable to share the same emotional space without reopening wounds. The world around them looks different now. Familiar places feel haunted, memories feel heavier, and the future feels uncertain. They move through life with a kind of quiet strength, but also with a sadness that sits just under the surface. People in their community treat them with sympathy, but sympathy cannot fill the empty spaces left behind. For the community as a whole, the crime becomes a story that will be told for years. It reshapes how people see each other and how they move through their daily lives. Parents become more protective of their children. Neighbors pay closer attention to signs they might have ignored before. People rethink the trust they place in others, even those they have known for a long time. Local leaders push for changes, better support systems, clearer reporting channels, and stronger community programs to prevent anything similar from happening again. Schools talk about emotional awareness and healthy communication. Churches, clubs, and town organizations hold meetings about safety and unity. But even with these steps, the community carries a scar. It becomes part of the town's history, a reminder of how fragile normal life can be and how darkness can grow quietly in the shadows of everyday routines. The case sparks larger conversations beyond the town as well. Newspapers, academics, and social groups use the crime as an example of deeper issues in society. How power can be abused, how hidden struggles can go unnoticed, and how communities sometimes fail to support those who are vulnerable or in crisis. Discussions arise about mental health, access to resources, and the need for better protective systems. People question how someone could hide dangerous behaviors behind a mask of normalcy. The crime becomes part of a bigger reflection on human behavior and the structures in place to prevent violence. It reminds people that crime does not always happen at the hands of strangers in dark, distant places. Sometimes it grows quietly inside familiar homes, relationships, and routines that appear harmless from the outside. When people look back on the story, they often focus on the idea of morality. Not the kind of morality found in textbooks or neat lessons, but the complicated kind that lives inside real human lives. The crime shows how thin the line can be between right and wrong when pressure builds, when emotions get tangled, and when people feel trapped or ignored. It shows how someone can convince themselves that what they are doing is justified, even when it clearly crosses every boundary of ethics and decency. In this story, morality is not a simple rule. It is a fragile thread stretched between choices, fears, desires, and pain. When that thread snaps, the fallout is devastating. The case forces people to admit that good and evil do not always live in separate worlds. They can exist inside the same person, shifting with circumstance, emotion, and opportunity. Power dynamics also take center stage in the reflection on the crime. The way one person controlled another, the way fear shaped behavior, the way silence grew stronger than truth, all of it shows how dangerous imbalances of power can be. Whether the power came from physical strength, emotional manipulation, financial control, or psychological pressure, it created a chain of events that spiraled into tragedy. People begin to understand that power does not always look like dominance from the outside. Sometimes it looks like persuasion, guilt, or dependence. Sometimes it hides in the small ways someone influences another person's choices. And when that power twists into something toxic, it can destroy lives long before anyone realizes what is happening. In the end, the story becomes a complicated lesson about human nature. No one in the tale remains the same. Even those who were not directly involved feel the shift inside themselves. They become more aware of the hidden sides of the people around them. They begin to question what they assume about others. They learn that everyone carries emotions they do not speak about, and that these emotions, left unchecked, can grow into something dangerous. The story does not offer easy answers. It does not promise that justice brings healing or that time erases pain. Instead, it highlights how delicate relationships can be, how quickly trust can be broken, and how deeply actions can affect others. By the time the story reaches its end, what remains is a sense of reflection. Everyone touched by the crime carries their own version of the lesson, some about remorse, some about grief, some about caution, and some about strength. The case becomes part of their personal history, shaping the way they think, feel, and interact with the world. Justice has been served in the way the system allows, but true justice feels more complicated. Healing begins, but it is slow and uneven. The people move forward, but they carry pieces of the story with them, reminders of how life can shift in a single moment. And as the years pass, the crime becomes a story told not just for its tragedy, but for the warning it carries about morality, power, and the fragile, unpredictable nature of the human heart.